Hi, this is David Clemmons. This is a recording of the last half of the notes on Chapter 4 for 11th grade APUSH History. And I need you to know that we talked about the Enlightenment today in class, but I need you to read over those Enlightenment notes from Chapter 4 that I posted on Canvas. Those are very important to understanding how America was influenced by the Enlightenment. For example, the Declaration of Independence is an Enlightenment document. The Enlightenment is a part of our bones. So please read that carefully. That can be a really great thing when you're writing your essay for the AP exam, or maybe one of those that we do for us this fall too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with page 5, American Pietism and the Great Awakening. I'm going to go over that, and then we'll go on to the end of the chapter to wrap up things on Chapter 4 for the folks that are in zero-hour class. Okay, and I'll post this up for you guys. Okay, so American Pietism and the Great Awakening. Pietism, an evangelical Christian movement that stressed a personal relationship with God. It attracted farmers and urban laborers. It appealed to believers' hearts rather than minds. In the mid-1730s to the early 1740s, it's a tremendous religious revival called the Great Awakening. It swept across the Protestant world. It was huge in England, Scotland, New England, and the Middle Colonies. The origins of the revivals. Some of the earliest revivals arose among the Dutch in New Jersey. There was also a harvest of souls in New England between the 1760s and 1729, led by Solomon Stoddard. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement in England, and George Whitefield, the great evangelist preacher, gained experience at missionary work in Georgia. They utilized revivals, great preaching that brought forth an emotional response to God's word that brought sudden conversions to thousands of people. Okay? So those are some of the backgrounds where these revivals came from. A revival is usually a week of preaching and singing and worship where you try to get the congregation to get as many converts to Christianity as you possibly can. More on the background. In 1722, the entire faculty at Yale College had defected from the Puritan Congregationalist Church to the Anglicans. In other words, they're going to the Church of England, except for one man, Jonathan Edwards. Now, Edwards was the grandson of Solomon Stoddard, the guy of the Harvest of Souls back in New England. You wonder if he was sitting on Granddad's knee while Granddad told stories about these Harvest of Souls when he decided, when he was a young preacher himself, that he would do this too. He touched off a revival in New England in his sermons preached in dozens of Connecticut Valley towns in 1734 and 1735. Now, in those days, college professors as well as seminary professors in many cases would make extra money in the summertime by going around and relieving preachers from their churches, from their pulpits, and preaching revivals for them to get the congregation fired up about their faith. Okay? So, these came to an abrupt end when in the middle of one service, a man felt so guilty for his own sins that he got up and he said, "I am so guilty for my sins, I'm going to cut my throat." And he cuts his throat and he died. Now that will bring an end to a revival really quickly. Okay? A couple of years later, after he got over the shock, Jonathan Edwards wrote a 1737 book, A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Works of God, describing the revival, and it won admirers all over the British Empire, both on the American side and on the British side of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the preaching of Edwards and those to follow him was the type that was highly emotional, the hellfire and brimstone sermons, you know, the kind that are turn or burn. His most famous sermon was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Now, I know you all are reading that in your English classes. I want to tell you that I know that he read those sermons kind of in a monotone, but in a very different kind of way. George Whitefield had much more emotional sermons because he had a background in theater. And so he would give those kind and style of sermons with much more flair and much more enthusiasm. And he would whip up people into almost a fever pitch over that. George Whitefield launches the Transatlantic Revival. He made a tour through America in 1740 that generated a phenomenal response. He was not popular among Anglicans, but Baptists, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians embraced him. To many, he embodied the old non-separatist ideal that all English Protestants were really members of the same church. Now, there were some disruptions. Some preachers who tried to follow Whitefield's example aroused fierce controversy. His successors created serious disturbances in New England. Whitefield knew how to start softly, build up to the hellfire and brimstone sermons with enthusiasm and yelling and preaching and crying and wailing and stuff and so on. But he also knew how to bring it back down and get everybody calmed down before they left the service. Others, practicing at what he preached, they began to do it where they got people all wound up, but they didn't know how to settle everybody down. Sometimes after churches that other preachers got people fired up, sometimes there'd be fights in the streets out in front of the church after the congregation had their church services. So it caused a lot of trouble. His long-term consequences of the revival. As time passed, they feminized the evangelical churches because many men quit attending. Thousands of men joined the Freemasons instead of joining the church. Now, this nearly turned the Masons into a religion of manliness. They extolled sobriety, industry, brotherhood, benevolence, and citizenship. All these developments shattered the unity of New England's Puritan church. Now, one of the legacies of the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening, is this. After the First Great Awakening, after the 10, 12, 15 years that it went on, what happens over time is that the men decide they don't want to be around all these emotional women, the crying, the wailing, the sobbing that takes place in these services. So they leave. So from the 1740s up until today, for the last 350 years or so, the Methodist and Baptist and Presbyterian and other churches in America have about 2/3 of the people who come are women, and only about 1/3 are men. And if you visit any church on Sunday morning in America at 11 o'clock, you're going to see more women than there are men in church. That's a result going all the way back to the Great Awakening. Okay? All these developments shattered the unity of the New England church. It broke down localism by creating new cosmopolitan links with Britain. Whitefield's Great Awakening, he spoke from memory about the power of God and the need to seek salvation. Followers were called New Lights for their claim that they felt new light in them after hearing Whitefield preach. Okay? Also, religious upheavals in the North. Letter C. Old lights and new lights. Old lights, conservative ministers condemned the crying and fainting of new lights in revival meetings, and the new light practice of women speaking in public. The new lights withheld tax payments from old light churches. New enthusiasm for religion led to the founding of schools for ministers. More of the Ivy League is founded during this time than any other period. Princeton, Columbia, Brown, and Rutgers were all founded as New Light schools for New Light preachers. People felt new power to be a part of the religious experience. There were also challenges to authority. The Great Awakening challenged the authority of all ministers. It gave a new sense of authority to the many who felt more justified in expressing religious and political opinions. Because you had preachers who were going from church to church to church and visiting, and so people didn't follow their own local congregation or pastor quite as often or as much. Okay, so next we're going to look at letter D, social and religious conflict in the South, the Presbyterian Revival. New Lights challenged the Church of England in the South. Ritual displays of wealth became less meaningful as competition existed between the churches. Virginia governor denounced the New Lights as offering false teachings. Oh my. The Baptist insurgency. In the 1760s, thousands of white farmers converted to baptism, adult baptism. George Whitefield encouraged slaveholders to bring the enslaved to church, but many whites opposed. So there are going to be some people that are going to start advocating teaching religion to the slaves in the 1760s. Free blacks in Virginia embraced the church's teachings. Baptist churches continued to grow in spite of these pressures. Ministers spread teaching among slaves and began to shrink the cultural divide between black and white. Okay? Now, I'm going to stop there and divide this into two videos so that this second video is not quite so long, or the first video is not as long as the first. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and then we'll pick up with the second video, and I'll post both of these.